The AC1 Sentinel was a cruiser tank designed in Australia in World War II in response to the war in Europe, and to the threat of Japan expanding the war to the Pacific, or even a feared Japanese invasion of Australia. It was the first tank to be built with a hull cast as a single piece, and the only tank to be produced in quantity in Australia. The few Sentinels that were built never saw action, as Australia's armoured divisions had been equipped by that time with British and American tanks. When design work began in 1940 in November, the AC1 was originally intended to be a 2-pounder gun-equipped vehicle that was intended to be a true cruiser tank, with a weight of between 16 and 20 tons. Due to a lack of homegrown experience in tank design, a mission was sent to the US to examine the M3 design, and Colonel W.D. Watson, an artillery officer with many years of tank design experience, was provided by the UK. He arrived in December of 1940. Like the Canadian Ram, the Australian cruiser was to be based on the engine, drivetrain, and lower hull of the American M3 medium tank, mated to an upper hull and turret built closely along the lines of the British Crusader. By 1942, attempting to keep pace with German tank developments, the design specification had become more like an American medium tank, resulting in a heavier design and a higher silhouette profile. The Australian Cruiser Tank Mark I, AC1, was designated Sentinel in February of 1942. Manufactured by the New South Wales Railway Company, fabrication took place at Sydney's Chullora tank assembly shops, with serial production vehicles emerging in August of 1942, the premises also being used as a testing ground. The design used existing parts were available from other tank designs, simplified where necessary to match the machining capacity present in Australia. The hull was cast as a single piece, as was the turret, a technique not used on the hull of any other tanks of the era. The Sentinel was designed to mount either a quick-firing 2-pounder or a quick-firing 6-pounder, 57mm. However, as the production order for 6-pounder tanks had not been acted on, none of these were available, and the first 65 tanks were built with the 2-pounder. 2 Vickers machine guns were carried as secondary armament, one in the hull and a second mounted coaxially beside the main gun. The preferred engine suitable to power a 28-ton tank, a Pratt & Whitney Wasp single-row petrol radial or a Giberson diesel radial, were not available in Australia, so the Sentinel was powered by the combined output of 3 Cadillac 346 cubic inch V8 petrol car engines installed in a cloverleaf configuration, 2 engines side by side to the front and a single to the rear, all feeding to a common gearbox. 65 production vehicles had been completed by June of 1943. The completed Sentinel tanks were used for evaluation purposes only and were not issued to operational armoured units. The Australian cruiser tank program was terminated in July of 1943, believing it better for Australia to put the effort spent on the AC tanks towards building her own railway locomotives and supporting the large numbers of US tanks due to arrive. The tanks that had been produced were placed in storage until the end of the war. In 1943, the 3rd Army Tank Battalion was equipped with a squadron of AC1 tanks, which had been modified to resemble German tanks. These tanks were used in the filming of the movie The Rats of Tobruk. This appears to have been the only time a squadron of Sentinels were used for any purpose. All but 3 tanks were disposed of by the Australian government in 1945. The 65 tanks that were not required to serve as physical record in war museums in Australia and the UK were sold off by the Commonwealth Disposals Commission. Of the 3 that were retained, the first is at the RAAC Tank Museum at Puckapunyal, Victoria, and the second is at Bovington Tank Museum. The third, and only completed AC3, is located at the Chullora Technology Centre at the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. From those that were sold, mostly for agricultural use, a 3rd AC1 was reassembled at the Melbourne Tank Museum using the hull of an AC1 and the turret of another AC1. This tank was sold to the Military Vehicle Technology Foundation when the Melbourne Tank Museum closed in 2006, and subsequently bought by Wargaming when the MVTF collection was partly auctioned in 2014. It was placed on exhibit at the Camp Marbury Museum in Austin, Texas for a period before being shipped to the Australian Armour and Artillery Museum to be repainted and put on display. A second Australian cruiser tank is also on display at the AAAM. This tank, acquired from the MTM, has a largely uncut hull with turret, gearbox and running gear, otherwise bare inside. This vehicle consists of the hull of an AC1, designated 8040, and an AC3 turret. The tank was externally restored in 2014. It now has a 17-pounder barrel in an attempt to represent the AC4 prototype. The manlet and gun were fabricated by the AAAM. An AC3 mock-up was assembled from unused AC3 armour castings and a mix of AC3 and AC1 parts at the Melbourne Tank Museum in 1996 to 1997, and this piece was sold to a private collector in 2006. Thank you guys so very much for watching. If you did like this video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you want similar content going into the future. Thanks guys.